Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I am Danielle, aka Stitcherista here on YouTube, and today is another stitch with me while I continue working on Modern Folk Embroideries Fruits of Plenty Sampler. The two colors I'm using is DMC 3750, which is the blue color, and DMC 958, which is the green color. And I'm stitching this on 28 count Joblin in lamb's wool. I'm using 2 strands over 2. Loving it. I love this sampler. I've enjoyed it very much over the couple of weeks that I've been working on it. Now I'm very much behind on it because this started at the beginning of this year and, you know, there's already 8 parts released, but no worries there, right? And today is a true crime story time. So today's story is called Below Zero. Back in the early 70s, Gary Dale Mathias had been a U.S. serviceman stationed in West Germany. But Gary had developed a drug problem, Gary, and had eventually received a medical discharge after he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. I can't even imagine. Thereafter, he returned to his home of Yuba City, California, where he was employed in his father's landscaping business. Stelazine and Cogentin were prescribed to control his symptoms, and he was treated as an outpatient at a local VA hospital. He also started attending the Yuba City Gateway Rehabilitation Center. It was there that he met Jack Madruga, a fellow veteran, and through him, 3 other regulars at the facility, Jackie Hewitt, Ted Weher, and William Sterling. And the 5 of them would soon become inseparable. What is unique about this group of friends is that all of them had psychiatric or developmental issues. Mathias, as we already know, was schizophrenic. The other 4 were intellectually impaired and considered slow learners. All of them lived at home with their parents, who referred to them collectively as the boys. They shared a common love of sports, but were particularly interested in basketball. At the rehabilitation center, they formed a team which they called the Gateway Gators. On February 25, 1978, the Gators were due to play their first game in a tournament sponsored by the Special Olympics. The prize for the winners was a week-long trip to Los Angeles, all expenses paid. Ooh, I bet they were excited about that. The night before the tournament was a time of high excitement for the 5 members of the Gators team. Uniforms were laid out and sports bags packed, ready for the coming day's event. Ted was particularly pumped up. He asked his mother to wash his new white high-top sneakers and kept reminding her to wake him on time. He kept saying, "Don't let me oversleep. We've got a big game Saturday." Before playing their first game, though, the Gators would attend another matchup, UC Davis versus CSU Chico. This was an away game for Davis, and that meant a 50-mile drive to Chico, California in the upper Sacramento Valley. The boys departed that evening in Ted's turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego. They were there to cheer Davis to victory, no doubt dreaming about the cheers that would be directed at them within the next 12 hours or so. After leaving the university campus at around 10 p.m., they stopped 3 blocks away at Bears Market, piling in just before the doors closed to buy snacks and sodas for the homeward journey. The store clerk remembered them clearly, since she was just about to cash up and was annoyed at the last-minute intrusion. From there, it was an easy 50-minute drive straight down Highway 70 to Yuba City. But the boys never made it home that night. And had still not arrived by daybreak. By then, anxious calls had been exchanged between their parents, and the decision had been taken to call the Yuba County Sheriff's Department. A search was then launched, with deputies from Yuba and Yuba and Butte counties driving the route they would have followed from Chico. They found no trace of the men or their vehicle. I'm always amazed, like, how do you find no trace of someone, right? That was to remain as the status quo until Tuesday, February 28th, when a forest ranger found the car abandoned on a dirt road near Oroville in the Plumas National Forest. Okay. The location of the vehicle had investigators scratching their heads. What was it doing here up in the mountains, a 2-hour drive from Chico, in the opposite direction from the route they should have taken? And why had the car been abandoned when it was fully operational and still had a quarter tank of gas? Why abandon it here to step out into frigid conditions which none of the men were dressed for? So many questions, right? These were questions that would require answers, but for now the priority was to find the missing men. A search was therefore launched with forest rangers exploring the wilderness on snowmobiles. The operation would continue for 5 days before it was eventually called off due to adverse weather conditions. A vicious blizzard was ripping through the area, depositing almost 9 inches of snow on the ground. Oy, oy, oy. There goes evidence, right? After that, the possibility of finding any tracks was gone. And if any of the men was caught outside in those conditions, he stood 0 chance of survival. Yeah, it's freezing, 9 inches of snow, not good. The police, meanwhile, were following a different strategy, appealing for information via the media. They were soon inundated with tips. I think people just live to give tips, personally. Like, I think these tip lines always get just so many, right? Most of these were easily dismissed, but 2 were considered worthwhile. The first of these was from a man named Joseph Schanz. Schanz had been driving the Oroville-Quincy Road that evening when his car got stuck in the snow. He had gotten out to try and free the vehicle from a rut, and as he did so, he experienced a sudden jab of pain in his chest and realized he was having a heart attack. Jesus! He then pulled himself back into the car and slumped into the driver's seat. He turned up the engine and got the heat going, hoping he could wait it out until help arrived. 6 hours later, 6 hours, that guy laid in his car. With the pain barely subsided, Schanz saw headlights approaching and a car stopped behind him. Schanz heard voices and called out for help. Then the lights were swiftly extinguished and the voices stopped. Then Schanz saw flashlights, which were again turned off when he called out. He would eventually make his own way to safety once the pain in his chest subsided. The police were certain that the individuals he saw were the missing Yuba 5, even though Schanz insisted that one of them was a woman holding a baby. Okay. He would later admit he was delirious with pain and might have been mistaken. All right. The other reported sighting was by a clerk who worked at a store in Brownsville, a tiny hamlet about 30 miles from where the Mercury Montego was found abandoned. She claimed that 4 of the men had stopped at the store in a red pickup truck 2 days after their disappearance. 2 of them waited outside while the other 2 entered the store and bought burritos, chocolate milk, and soda. The description she gave were a close approximation of the missing men, offering hope that they might still be alive. Certainly, the sheriff thought that the sighting was valid. He would be proved wrong in that regard. 3 months pass. 3 months. Holy shit. How do 5 people just up and go missing, right? 3 months passed without news of the men or any clue as to their whereabouts. On June 4th, with most of the snow now melted away, on June, I would think so, a group of motorcyclists took a ride up the Oroville-Quincy Road and then veered off the main path towards a campsite around 19 miles into the trees. The Forest Service maintained a trailer here, and that's where the bikers were headed. Arriving at the site, they noticed immediately that the front window of the trailer had been smashed, and approaching it, they picked up a noxious odor coming from within. One of the men then entered the trailer, only to come staggering out a moment later. There was a dead body inside. The corpse, identified by dental records, turned out to be Ted Weir. Then, as the police and Forest Service launched a search of the area, they recovered 2 more bodies, Jack Madruga and William Sterling. These were about 8 miles from the trailer on either side of the road. Madruga's body had been partially consumed by animals. Jesus God. Sterling's had been reduced to a pile of scattered bones, and autopsies would determine they had died of hypothermia. So it's like, why did they get out of their car if their car was still running and had gas? What happened that they got out? So, 3 of the missing men had now been accounted for, while the fate of the other 2 remained uncertain. 2 days later, that number was reduced to 1 when Jack Hewitt's father, who had joined the search as a civilian volunteer, found a human spine concealed in heavy brush 2 miles northeast of the trailer. The following day, a deputy sheriff discovered a skull about 300 feet downhill, and the bones were all that remained of Jack Hewitt. He too had succumbed to hypothermia. So you would think that, okay, they all succumbed to hypothermia out in this wilderness, and the reason their bones are scattered are animals probably got to them, right? Yeah. Of the final member of the party, Gary Mathias, no trace has ever been found. He is presumed to have died on the mountain. But why? So how are we to unravel this tragedy? Yeah. What happened on the mountainside that night? The scenario that is usually presented is that Jack Madruga got lost after leaving Chico and ended up on the Oroville-Quincy Road. There, the car got stuck in the snow and the group decided to abandon it. Spotting snowmobile tracks, they decided to follow, believing the tracks would bring them to a cabin. In fact, the tracks had been made the previous day by a forest ranger headed for the trailer to replenish supplies there. The men had no way of knowing it was 19 miles away, so that seems plausible, and if you don't realize it's 19 miles away, I can see how they would have died from hypothermia trekking 19 miles. So none of the men were dressed for the frigid weather, and soon they all began to feel the effects of hypothermia. Sterling was particularly afflicted. After covering 11 miles in the bone-numbing cold, he lay down in the snow and refused to go on. This is a common symptom of hypothermia and overwhelming need to sleep. In any case, Madruga refused to abandon Sterling and stayed behind, perishing with him in the snow. The other three continued on and against all odds made it to the trailer. They would remain there through most of the winter, perhaps as long as 13 weeks. Holy shit! We know this because of the length of Ted's beard and because he lost almost half his body weight in that time. Eventually, after Ted's death, Hewitt and Mathias decided to find their way back to civilization, and they struck out in different directions only to perish in the wilderness. What a horrible story. That sounds plausible, though, but how horrific. This is a sensible explanation, stringing a plausible series of events into a quite convincing narrative. However, it raises a multitude of questions for which there are simply no answers. The first of these is that Jack Madruga got so hopelessly lost that the group ended up miles off track, driving in the opposite direction, and this makes no sense. Because the route between Chico and Yuba is as simple as they come, a straight shot down CA 70 without ever having to leave the highway. It is all but impossible to lose one's way along this route. So that makes no sense then. The second anomaly is that the Mercury became so hopelessly stuck in the snow that the men had to abandon it. And this simply isn't true, because while the car was most certainly stuck, it could easily have been pushed out of the rut by the 5 fit young men on board, so why didn't they do that? Right. It wasn't like it was one person, right? Then there is the route the men decided to take after leaving the car. On the way up the mountain, they would have passed a lodge, which was about 8 miles from the spot where they eventually got stuck. This was the same cabin that Joseph Shans made his way to after suffering his heart attack, so why didn't the men do likewise? Why not head back down the hill where they knew they would find help? Because if they passed the lodge, they must have seen it, right? Why trudge off into the darkness with no certain destination in mind? So none of these questions have ever been answered to anyone's satisfaction, but the greatest enigmas have to do with the time that Weir, Hewitt, and Mathias spent at the trailer. Ted's death was attributed to a combination of starvation and hypothermia, yet neither food nor heat should have been a problem for the men sheltering in the trailer. The place contained an ample supply of matches and stacks of paperback novels that could have been used as kindling, and there were plenty of twigs and branches to be found on the ground outside. Heavy coats hung in a closet which would have protected the men from the cold. Inexplicably, these were left untouched. In addition, there was a butane tank in a nearby shed attached to the trailer's heating system, and it was never turned on. You have to remember that these men were not, what's the word I'm looking for? They had some developmental or mental disabilities. Like, they weren't all thinking logically and clearly. Ever. I'm surprised the parents actually allowed them to all drive 50 minutes away, right? So there was also plenty of food in the trailer. About a dozen military C ration cans were indeed opened and presumably consumed. Yet a pantry full of dehydrated foods, enough to feed the 3 men for a year, were left untouched. At the time that Ted was wasting away, at the time that he suffered such severe frostbite that his feet ballooned up and became gangrenous, both food and heat were quite literally an arm's length away, so why not use them? One suggestion offered by Ted's family was that Ted simply lacked common sense. Yeah, like I said, like they didn't have the normal mental capacity that five of Bill and his friends would have had, right? So Ted's family described an incident where a fire broke out at their home and Ted refused to leave his bed, saying that he'd be late for work the next day if he did not get a good night's sleep. They had to drag him from the house as the flames took hold. But while the lack of smarts might have held for Ted and perhaps for Hewitt, it was not true of Gary Mathias. The ex-military man would have known how to survive in the wilderness, especially when surviving simply meant sitting tight, consuming the readily available rations, and keeping warm with the readily available heat source. So why he chose not to do so remains a mystery. That one is like, you could turn your mind over and over on that. Wow. I had never heard of that story. That was something else. So have you guys heard of it? What do you think? So many things just don't add up there. And the parents will never have a resolution. They'll never know what really happened. Okay. So remember to look for something positive in each day, even if some days you have to look a little harder. As always, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments section below and I will answer them to the best of my ability. Thank you so much for watching and subscribing, and I will see you in my next video. Bye, guys.